Throughout history, there have been countless accounts of mysterious and unexplained events from all corners of the world. But sometimes, it's not the tales from ancient folklore that captivate us the most. It's the first-hand accounts from those who've lived through them. Today, I'm going to share with you some chilling real-life events experienced by soldiers during their deployments in Afghanistan and Vietnam. These accounts might sound like they're straight out of a horror movie, but remember, every story I'm about to share is based on real-life testimonies. So, dim the lights, grab your favorite blanket, and let's dive in. In the mountainous regions of Afghanistan during the early 2000s, a group of American soldiers was on a mission. They were tasked with scouting the area to identify potential enemy hideouts. Such reconnaissance missions were not popular among the troops. The uncertainty of who they might encounter and the potential dangers were always present. Understandably, the mood was tense. The unit moved out at night, and by early morning they reached the edge of the territory under US military control. A village lay at the border, and the soldiers stopped there for a brief rest. They needed to conserve their energy. The next phase of their mission, trekking through the mountainous terrain, would be on foot. After their short break, the soldiers continued onward. Their squad included 2 locals who would serve as guides and interpreters. When informed about the area they'd be exploring, the local guides became visibly anxious. They warned the officers that Afghans living in the mountains avoided that region because they believed demons and vampires inhabited the numerous caves. The officers brushed off these concerns as mere superstitions and made it clear to the Afghan leaders that the mission was essential. Bill Kafner, a GI, later recounted that the officers essentially gave the Afghan leaders an ultimatum: either support the mission or face discharge from the US Army. Left with little choice, the Afghans relented and joined the group. By midday, they had reached a valley encircled by towering mountains with snow-capped peaks. In this valley, there were several abandoned villages. Local leaders say these villages were deserted because the inhabitants feared the vampires that lived there. Over the past few decades, these vampires have moved increasingly closer to populated settlements. After several residents went missing, the villagers abandoned their homes. The group entered the valley, and after about 2 hours, they first noticed something odd happening. Kafner mentioned that the soldiers saw unusual shadows darting between the mountain rocks. He likened it to catching a glimpse of a shadow out of the corner of your eye, only for it to vanish when you turn to look. It wasn't just 1 or 2 soldiers who observed this, but nearly all of them, including the officers who then ordered heightened alertness. The unit spread out further from one another. This tactic is used to avoid becoming an easy target, like when someone throws a hand grenade and could potentially kill everyone if they were clustered together. So, the soldiers maintained a larger distance from each other. A shrill scream came from behind. When the soldiers turned around, the last man in the line was gone. The officers immediately ordered everyone to take up positions, while the soldiers scrambled for cover wherever they could find it. Seconds later, almost simultaneously with the officers' commands, eerie noises echoed from the mountain slopes. They were inhuman screams. The 2 Afghan leaders claimed those were the screams of vampires before fleeing, leaving the soldiers alone. Soon, these screams echoed from all around them. They could now clearly see shadows darting across the rock walls. The officers opened fire on any identified targets. At first, the soldiers only saw the shadows, but then suddenly, one of the shadows seemed to leap out of the rock wall, stopping right in front of a GI. Kafner recounts what happened next. The GI had the presence of mind to raise his weapon and fire at the figure. However, when the bullet struck, no blood was shed. Instead, black smoke rose. Officers yelled commands and soldiers dove into trenches or took cover behind boulders. They suspected the figure might be a suicide bomber, thinking the black smoke came from the explosives hit by the soldiers' fire. After taking cover, the soldiers looked towards the figure, but it was gone. Instead, other figures emerged from the rock walls, clearly visible, running back and forth. Some lunged at the soldiers, just like the previous figure, prompting the soldiers to open fire. Whenever they hit one of these figures, black smoke rose from the spot. The whole situation would have continued for a while before the attacks ceased. By then, panic had set in among the soldiers because what they witnessed was beyond their understanding. After the attacks ended, the officers instructed their soldiers to search for their missing comrade, but he was never found. The unit abandoned its mission and headed back to the village at the edge of US-controlled territory. The two local leaders who had escaped never returned. The lingering question is, what did the soldiers actually see there? This is Tim King, a war reporter. He's the kind of journalist who is always on the scene of a crisis or conflict. He spent a few months in Afghanistan, but he's also been to other countries in the midst of war. He's witnessed a lot. Tim King spoke to the soldiers whose experiences I just described. Like many of you might feel, King thought their stories sounded a bit odd. Who knows what they really saw there? King then visited other US Army bases in Afghanistan, where soldiers directly asked him if he had heard about the vampires in the mountains. He had just heard about them. Gradually, he became intrigued by the topic. So, one evening, he sat down with some soldiers over beers and listened to their stories. He then found out that exploration teams in the remote mountain regions of Afghanistan had encountered these eerie figures on a couple of occasions. He also learned that the soldiers had lost one or two of their comrades in these attacks. At times, he felt that the soldiers were more afraid of these figures than they were of an actual enemy. He also discovered details about the appearance and behavior of these mysterious figures. While this type of vampire wasn't the kind we're familiar with, the ones that glitter in the sunlight when well-groomed, these creatures looked different. The soldiers estimated that they stood about 6 feet tall and were covered in dirt and dust. Some had odd markings on their bodies. They moved upright but occasionally on all fours. They were incredibly fast and could make massive leaps. When there was a confrontation with these beings, it mirrored past encounters. Instead of bleeding when injured, they emitted a kind of black smoke. And he discovered something else. An officer informed him that he, along with a few others, had guided a CIA team into the mountains. This CIA team was dispatched to investigate the vampire rumors and, if possible, to capture one. However, they were unsuccessful. The reason was straightforward. No attacks occurred on the CIA operatives while they were in the mountains. The creatures never appeared. Yet, there were numerous accounts from locals in mountain villages who had encountered these bizarre beings. These accounts corroborated the soldiers' stories. The descriptions they provided were accurate. Interestingly, if someone did manage to confront these creatures and injure them, the creatures were said to emit black smoke. But only a few have lived to tell this tale. Encounters with these beings are usually fatal for humans. King noted that the mountain villagers strongly believe in the existence of these vampires. While these vampires had been in the mountains for centuries, they now seemed to be moving closer and closer to human settlements. They would prey on animals, draining their blood, and they had already kidnapped 1 or 2 children or elderly people from the villages. That's why residents began bringing their livestock inside their homes in the evenings to protect them from vampire attacks. The children and elderly are only allowed to stay in front of the houses, essentially in the center of the village. The vampires still avoided this area. These particular vampires had the unusual ability to appear during the day. It's not like the vampire stories we know where they turn to dust in sunlight. Still, they typically come out at night. Locals have reported villages in the mountains being completely abandoned. This was due to the growing fear of the vampires roaming the area and the increasing number of victims. Well, it is all very odd. You've got to wonder, what's going on? What could these people and the soldiers be seeing? It's worth mentioning that Tim King, the reporter, has never written a book on the subject. However, he has been on several news programs discussing what soldiers in Afghanistan have told him. We're shifting our focus to Vietnam in 1970. During the Vietnam War, there was a reconnaissance unit there. This unit had been traveling for several hours when they reached a small river. They followed it upstream through the thick jungle. Eventually, they encountered a ravine, and soon after, massive rock walls towered on both sides. The lieutenant leading the exploration party discussed with some soldiers whether they should venture into the small ravine. Tactically, it wasn't a smart move. If the enemy shoots from above, they'd be trapped like in a cage. So they decided against it. And since the rocks weren't very high, the soldiers opted to take the route over them. There was no enemy contact there, But at the end of the small ravine, the soldiers found a cave below them. While some soldiers stayed on the rock with a clear view of the cave, the lieutenant ordered 5 of them to follow him. They descended the smaller rock walls and found themselves at the base of a cave. The first thing the soldiers noticed was the overpowering stench of decay. It was so strong that some began to choke. As they approached the cave, the smell grew even more intense. Soon, they could see the source of the odor. Numerous half-decayed animal carcasses littered the cave entrance. The soldiers observed that the better-preserved carcasses seemed to have been violently torn apart. The lieutenant believed there might be a wild animal inside and saw no need to investigate the cave further. And just as he was about to give the order to leave, an eerie scream echoed from the cave. The soldiers quickly raised their rifles. Moments later, a horrific creature reportedly leapt from the cave towards them. The soldiers described the creature as over 6 feet tall, walking upright and having big fangs. When asked later, all of them claimed they had never seen anything like it before. A second creature, identical in appearance, followed it out of the cave, both emitting blood-curdling screams. Despite their size, they moved so fast that they easily dodged the barrage of bullets by quickly jumping to the side. Apparently, these creatures moved swiftly along the steep rock faces. By the time the soldiers approached, the creatures had already vanished. Eventually, the soldiers scaled the rock walls quickly and fled into the jungle. For the soldiers atop the cliffs, everything happened so suddenly and unexpectedly that they couldn't react at all. At the base, the lieutenant gave his report. He said that none of the soldiers could identify or explain what those creatures were. What was certain was that they walked on 2 legs and had incredible climbing skills. However, it was impossible to determine exactly what animal they were. It does make you wonder if this group of soldiers were unable to recognize a monkey, or what those creatures actually were. One thing's for sure, these creatures seem to be carnivores. There is no definite answer to what it might have been, so we're still speculating. But what is your take on this? What do you think the soldiers encountered there? And what do you think the American soldiers saw in Afghanistan? If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. I'd appreciate that. See you soon. Thanks for watching.